Welcome to a little bit different than what I've normally been doing, which is book reviews. Today, I wanted to talk about how I start a new relationship with a deity. Starting a relationship with a new deity can be a bit overwhelming, especially if you're not used to doing that. If you are in a coven setting where it's very strict on like what deities you work with, and then, you kind of graduate from the coven or whatever, or you decide it's not a good fit, or you're just solitary, and you decide that you want to start adventuring into specific deities rather than kind of the generic look that is really popular in Wicca and Wicca-based witchcraft, it can be a little daunting to think about how to start that new relationship. And I do feel like sometimes in the spell books and spell sections that we find, that it's just kind of this given of like, oh, well, you just call to this random deity that you've never talked to just for, asking for a handout, basically. Just going up to them like, gimme. That I don't love that vibe. I would rather make a connection with that deity before asking for something. So whether you are doing it because, maybe you want to start honoring like a cat goddess, so you pick like Bast or Freya, or you decide that, you're going to get into like doing welding and you decide to go to some of the smithing gods to kind of bless that journey. You want to start to build a relationship, or even just you want to because it's fun. You see other people dedicated to deities. So this is roughly what I will do every single time I consider starting a new relationship. So the very first thing is, obviously by this point you've picked their name, you've picked who you're going to look into. You want to, start a relationship with Luna or with Hel or with Isis, whoever. You've picked the deity. Next is to look into the mythology, know their backstory, because while I'm not huge into thinking mythology really matters, I am in the mindset that you need to know the context from which they come from. Obviously, you don't have to do a deep dive into the myths, but you need to know their basic story. And really, just about any deity, you can Google and find something. You don't have to necessarily go out and buy a bunch of books or rent them from the library, though I do recommend that. Check your local library. Usually mythology, even in Bible Belt areas, will have mythology books. But start there. Get to know their stories, because typically most deities will have at least one or two stories that they are a part of. I say usually. I'm pretty sure there's some that isn't the case. I really haven't come across a lot of, in the Norse mythology, for instance, there are supposedly a certain amount of handmaids to Frigg, pretty sure, and I don't know their names. And even trying to find a lot for I think it's pronounced air, but it looks like ear, and she's the healer goddess, but there's really not a lot. Compared to stories for Odin, where he is a big player, he's going to have a lot of stories. But, for instance, with Odin, I'm going to look up all of his stories. I'm going to look up, the context. Where does he fit into that group of gods? Because I just feel like it matters. Even Caradwyn, there's not a whole lot that I can find, but I found a little bit just so I get an idea of what role they have played. And just, the general idea of where they fit in their own pantheon. After looking at their past, I moved to modern associations and modern interpretations, because how our ancestors viewed a lot of these myths and the stories with the gods and interactions with them has drastically changed to nowadays. The classic example is going to be Persephone. In the past, she was often described as the victim, and it was just an innocent girl that was kidnapped and tricked by Hades, where nowadays most people view that story quite differently, in that she didn't want to just be known as Demeter's daughter. She wanted to make, her own path, and she ended up deciding to go down and explore the underworld, and then ended up liking it and wanted to become the queen there. And, it's, if you've ever eaten a pomegranate, picking out 6 seeds in particular was that was intentional. And so, look at modern associations. Even now, people will look at Fenrir in Norse mythology, where in the past, I don't think he was probably really honored, but now a lot of people will go to him for very specific needs. And obviously, I mean, it's going to be the same as like if you go to Loki, like you need to have specific reasons to go to that particular deity. They tend to be a lot more chaotic. But even then, Fenrir is all about breaking your bindings and to be all about freedom and also revenge. And so, like, looking at the modern interpretations is just as important as the past, because the past, we don't know how accurate it was recorded. A lot of it was changed because it wasn't written down by the people who even believed it. It was written down by Christians. And we know that they like to change the narrative to fit their world. There was a lot of goddesses that were changed and were just omitted completely. Along with the kind of story modern associations, I also will look into the like magical correspondences, so crystals, colors, altars, how are people modernly dealing with this deity? Because, you know, if you look into like Santa Muerte, there is very specific rules already set in place. Colors have specific meanings, how you treat like the altar and the statue, what is required on the statue, and like like, you know, like there's just certain features that are like very common, and you need to make sure that it's this, you know, particular kind of saint deity somewhere between the two and make sure it's not a different figure, and that, you know, you have to treat it a certain way and how you give the offerings in a certain way. And obviously not all deities are going to have that level, but just to find out how modern people are handling this deity. After all of the research is done, that is when I will do a formal introduction ritual. So this is when you pull out all the bells and whistles. This is not the time to do your simplified versions. This is when you put on, you know, if you have ritual wear that you have, this is the time to wear it. You do the full, all the stops. You know, clean the space, you cleanse the space, you cast the full circle, you use all the tools, all the things. Go very formal with how you are approaching them for the first time. And pretty much any deity will have some form of like, you know, maybe have a candle for them that you're going to light, and potentially have like an offering to give them, and just sit down and introduce yourself, state your intentions, maybe do a card pull to see if you can get an answer, or just go intuitively, but just slowly start to introduce yourself before you jump in with, again, the held out hand of like, gimme, gimme. Wait a while for that. Make sure that you're actually going to get together, get along, make sure the answer is yes. So like, I wouldn't do a spell or anything with them for at least like a month, and really do like as close to daily as possible work with that deity, again, before you're sitting there like, okay, and now let's work together to do this spell. And kind of along that line, I do a lot of like formal offerings. So again, this comes back to that researching part at the beginning for the modern associations. This is when I will give offerings that are typically associated to them. So for instance, a lot of people will give a shot of like whiskey to Loki, and that's just like kind of the thing that you do. And then as you start to work with them, and you might get more intuitive hits, you might get more ideas, you might change it. For instance, a lot of people will give Odin also some whiskey, but personally, I have found that he prefers black coffee, strong black coffee. When I make it too weak, it tends to not be totally loved. But, you know, try and figure out what your offerings are going to be. And it doesn't have to be complex. Again, a cup of coffee or, you know, a stick of incense. Certain like flavors have not been taken well. And usually you can tell, I mean, sometimes it's going to be just like the vibe of a room. Like I've done some where I'll light the incense and you walk into that room for the rest of the day and it just feels like cozy and witchy and inspiring and just like this warm, cozy inside. And then other times you walk in and you just feel like you need to clean the room, and it's just this heaviness and just ick in the air. And that's when I know that that's just not one that I need to use. Like cinnamon incense is a no. Even though I wanted it to be one, I bought a bunch of it when I got it, and nobody liked it. And it's like, well, that's fine. So, you know, take into account how you want to do your offerings. If it's an established one, and like a safe one to always go with is water, just a little cup of water. And that does, I've noticed it a lot with the Santa Muerte in particular, and like ancestor altars, a lot of like kind of Central America-ish area tends to do this where it's a cup of water as an offering. And I love it. We have water. We have tap water. Tap water is just fine. You don't need to go find spring water or well water. That's a privilege to have. Just give some fresh, clean water. Change it out daily. You can pour it outside or even just down the drain if you have to, but leave it for like 24 hours. That's a really easy offering for just about anybody, whatever deity you pick. Water is a great option. If you can do more, that's great, but don't feel bad if you can only do water for a day or two or a week or a month or whatever until you really establish that relationship. Then you might want to put a little more effort in, even just making tea, a specific tea for them. Tea is not expensive. You can get a box of it for a couple dollars. It doesn't have to be the expensive brand. You can get the store brand. Just give a little offering and do it consistently. And the last thing that I do is I will usually go to them in a meditation at some point. So it might be in the introduction ritual, it might be when I do my daily offerings, or it might be later. At some point though, I will do a meditation. Typically, I will use the techniques that I learned from Inner Temple of Witchcraft, because there's a whole setup on how to enter into the astral realm and to really get into the meditative state and all of that. If you're not really familiar with meditation and you kind of struggle with it, go do that book. It's a lot of work, but it is well worth it because then you have that tool and you're just ready to go. But I will usually take some time to meditate with that deity quite a few times before, again, I either decide that, okay, this is a relationship to pursue and they seem to be handling it well, it seems to be a two-way street, or if the answer is no, then you know that, okay, maybe not right now, maybe not in this lifetime, and then you can respectfully say thanks for your time and move on to the next one. After this, you can actually begin to really build that relationship, start getting your altar set up and getting statues and all sorts of things. But until you really know if it's going to be a long-term commitment, these things you don't need to go out and spend a lot of money on. This is just to start that relationship, and then, it changes a little bit once you're dedicated to actually working with them. You're committed to it. That's when I'll go out and I'll consider getting, at the very least, I'll print off a picture of that particular deity, or I will eventually go get a statue, but they're usually expensive. Or I might make one, be able to just even do it yourself, draw it, paint it, carve it, wood burn it, whatever. Do something to start building that altar, getting, I'll collect crystals and random little bits out in nature and start putting it on the altar, getting specific candles for them. But that's after we've already done all of these other steps. So usually this is 1 to 2 months after I decide to start that relationship. And that is it. That is how I start a relationship with a new deity. I would love to know how you do it. Do you add other things in? Do you not do all of these steps? I know it can be quite a bit, but for me, I want to approach it very respectfully, and that is just my way of doing it respectfully. So I would love to know how you do this in the comments down below. A huge thank you to my patrons. If you want to support me and get access to a bunch of content, I've got a lot going up this month. It is patreon.com/nightwillowcrafts. Of course, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. I post every single day, and until next time, blessed be.